Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. On this week's podcast, Lawanda Ravoira, President Emeritus of the Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center in Jacksonville, Florida, joins to talk about juvenile justice systems and how they continue to whiff on designing effective interventions and solutions for girls, and to discuss her organization's new See the Girl manifesto aimed at improving things on that score. It's a really great conversation. Lawanda was a very early thinker and actor on this issue well before more people started to realize that we needed a different approach to address the unique needs and interests of young women who are involved in the juvenile justice system. Instead of headlines today, I'm going to bring in another guest from the Imprint family, and that is Nancy Marie Spears, a member of Cherokee Nation and a recent journalism graduate from the University of Oklahoma. We began working with Nancy in 2022 on a few stories related to the Indian Child Welfare Act, which, if you've been following this podcast, you know is at the center of a major Supreme Court case being heard next month, and about the Biden administration's work on unearthing truths and trauma from the notorious boarding school era that was, frankly, a chief driver of the need for the Indian Child Welfare Act in the first place. Now, I am happy to say that with support from Casey Family Programs, Nancy Marie Spears is the Imprint's full-time Indigenous children and families reporter, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say she's also the first person with that beat at any publication in this country. So I wanted to have her on the podcast to introduce her and talk a little bit more about this amazing new expansion of the Imprint's work. So Nancy Marie Spears, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast, and welcome to the Imprint family.
Hello. Thank you guys so much. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe. I'm very glad to be here and appreciate you having me.
And you'll be moving pretty soon, right? For this beat, you had a Denver way, I think, probably by the time folks hear this.
Yeah, by the time this podcast airs, I will be residing in a new state. I've been born and raised in Oklahoma, and I'm moving to Colorado now because I really wanted to be very centrally located to a lot of tribe-heavy states for this beat that we're building. And I'm very dedicated and committed to making sure that I do that work the most justice that I can. And so to do that, I felt that I needed to move out of my home state and get into something a little more accessible to those other states.
Absolutely. We're going to be sending Nancy all over the country, and we'll talk briefly in a minute about one of the first places that she'll be headed. But let's start here. Take us into the world of young Nancy Spears growing up. Did you always want to be a journalist? Is this something that you've been chasing since you were a little tyke, or what did the interest in journalism and that journalism bug hit you?
Oh gosh, the journalism bug hit me pretty early. I've always been a person that is very adversarial at heart, and I think that's really something that resonated with me throughout my childhood educational experience. Certainly, I'm a first-generation college student. I graduated salutatorian of my class in high school. I went to an online public high school, and I knew very early on that I was going to be a journalist. I grew up kind of in between two worlds here because I always grew up knowing that I was Native and that we were Native and were descended from the Cherokee Nation, but we have a propensity to pass as white people. And so that being said, I kind of grew up in these two worlds where there was this very uneducated narrative that was being pushed onto me as a very low income white passing family. And then growing up in Oklahoma with all this Indigenous history and knowing, very little through public education about our communities, it really kind of pushed me against that ignorance that I'd been seeing in my childhood from a very early age. I always knew that I was Native, but I didn't really start waking up to the larger framework of colonization and that type of thing within the communities I was working with, or the place, or my own place within Indigenous intergenerational trauma. I didn't really understand my place in any of that, start working through it until college, until high school, when I started realizing that Indian country was the place I wanted to do my coverage. Right after high school, when I graduated, I actually took an unpaid internship with a freelance journalist that was located in my area. And I worked under her for an entire summer, just unpaid, like in between high school and my first semester of college. And I learned the layout, all the ropes of like layout and design. And she worked for a print paper. So I learned a lot about design and layout, but I also just learned a lot about photojournalism and doing a lot in terms of and a lot about community journalism in terms of, really seeking to delve into a community and become part of a community. I did a lot of coverage of children actually during that summer. We went to the community center and I worked with kids all the time. And I really learned what it meant to be a community journalist. And I really applied that to my national work as an Indigenous and investigative journalist now. I don't know if that answers your question really, but in terms of my journey, it's just kind of come from this place of wanting to push back against the false narrative that I'd been seeing about our people and trying to do something about it in a larger scope. And so I realized in high school that the only way I'd be able to do that was to go to college and to get out of the situation that I was in. So I worked my ass off. I got a bunch of scholarships to be able to go. I wouldn't have been, I'm the type of student that really wouldn't have been in college if it hadn't been for federal scholarships and state, aid. That's just the first thing. It's really important to me, I think, that I take and carry all this humble awareness with me as I do my work, because I easily could have been someone that became a statistic and I didn't. And I feel like I have an obligation to do something with that. And that's kind of why I'm here today.
Thinking back, do you remember your first published piece?
My very first piece that I really remember being published in terms of being Indigenous coverage, my very first piece was my first semester as a journalist. I was doing a story about the local tribe's relationship with the university and with presidents of that university, given that, coming from the University of Oklahoma, Cleveland County, it sits on Indigenous land. So I wanted to examine that relationship and that history in a closer way. And so I did archival research, I did yearbook research, I was talking to people on the ground. And I pulled this story within my first semester. This was probably my fourth or fifth story that I published with the OU Daily at that time. And it was on the front page. And I still have the proof from that front pager because it was my very first front page story. And I was really proud of it because it was the first story I actually wanted to do, because it was Indigenous related. And it was something that was really a powerful, important issue that no one was really bringing light to at the time. And so I was really proud to be able to do that. And I still remember that.
So we have you writing about all kinds of things within the Indigenous community as it relates to family supports and child welfare and family separation to some extent. I'm curious, especially in regards to this law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that is kind of front and center right now as the Supreme Court prepares to hear oral arguments and possibly consider it unconstitutional. I'm just curious, as a young person in Oklahoma, were you aware of these issues? I mean, is any of this material kind of new to you now, or growing up, did you have some awareness or familiarity with either ICWA or all the other things that you're kind of working on now?
So growing up in Oklahoma, I'm definitely comfortable going on record to say that Oklahoma is one of the more anti-tribe states in terms of current governmental legislation right now. And I grew up with a lot of just non-education about our people and not really any kind of awareness of where the tribes were, where they had come from, the fact that they were still here. I mean, I grew up in public schools with people in Oklahoma that didn't even know tribes still existed. And that's a problem. And when you look at it in the larger narrative of, okay, we have this information ecology of a community and the passing of information about a demographic from one people to another, you start realizing that there are really implicit biases and generational biases that I grew up with my parents that I've had to learn to work against because of the fact that there's just no education and there's no coverage, certainly not enough media coverage in Oklahoma about Native people and about their cultures and their language and their land, which are all things that need to be front and center in the work that we're doing. I definitely grew up with an awareness that there were laws in place that were supposed to be specifically to help Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that equal was one of those things, along with, we had the Dawes rolls and the reallotment acts of all these different lands and tribal trustee lands. And I was aware of a lot of that. But, it's when you start really looking into the complex issues of tribal enrollment and just any child welfare situation is going to be a sticky situation because it involves children. And Native people, just growing up so close to Native people all my life, I know they cherish their children more than anything. They cherish them just as much as they cherish their land, their cultural stories, their traditions, their customs. It's just as important. There's no difference, really. And so for me, realizing that I was both a Native child and also growing up in a very white area, I grew up in a predominantly white area. And and it was just something that I was very aware of, but I didn't really know how to articulate having those conversations until I was older in high school, when I started really doing research to push back against everything that I had been seeing in my community about how, Native people were treated. And so I was kind of really hit early on with this research bug of like needing to make sure that I start figuring this out. Like I started waking up to it, and I just wanted to do more about it than what I was currently doing. And so I found that I was a very good writer. I've always been a good writer in high school. English was it was always my strongest subject all through school. And so I wanted to do something to help with what I was seeing in terms of the ignorance about a community. And that's not something that should be going on in this day and age at all, given, our technological advances and all that, even just from when I was a child. So yeah, it's something that I carry with me every day in terms of knowing that as a child, I was very aware of these biases and these racist ideals about Native children and Native women that I had heard, and just really wanting to do anything I could to advocate against that.
We're talking today on this podcast because, this beat has now started with you at the helm, kind of in earnest, but we've been working with Nancy at the Imprint for a while now. And, one of the stories I think you just knocked out of the park early on for us it was a great piece kind of reflecting on this day when Interior Secretary Deb Haaland visited Oklahoma for the healing tour. I was hoping maybe you could kind of, for folks who didn't read that story, and I'll link to it in our show notes, that must have been emotional for you just as a citizen of the state, and, but just what happened that day.
That was definitely a heavy day. Oklahoma was real crossroads for a lot of Indigenous trauma historically. I met people that had come from out of state, within the state. And it was a really big gathering of people. It was bigger than I had expected it to be. And of course, there were ribbon skirts. And, the reason that I was if you read the story, you'll know that there is a big kind of vignette about ribbon skirts and the colorful resiliency of these people. And the reason that was brought up is because ribbon skirts traditionally are worn for either celebratory purposes. They're also worn for mourning. And so there was a lot of mournful gestures on this day in terms of just, here we are, we're talking about this thing that has for so long been repressed and been something that was refused to be talked about. Because you have to understand, in Indigenous communities, when we're dealing with our elders and we're dealing with this intergenerational impact, those elders were raised, taught, had it tormented out of them that they were not to speak or talk about their language, their customs, and their stories. And so they refused to pass that on out of fear and out of, colonizational influences from the boarding schools and from foster care and adoption. And so when these stories get suppressed through a generation, when our elders refuse to tell us about them and don't want to teach us the language out of fear, it creates this quiet erosion of Indigenous sovereignty and of Indigenous individuality. You lose generations and you lose people when these things happen. So, when I was at the Road to Healing tour, it's a healing tour, right? It's supposed to be something that is hard, but it's something that involves a lot of healthy grieving, right?
Yeah.
There's a
catharsis.
Yeah, exactly. And so, with that being said, it was just something that being able to see all the lived experiences of so many different boarding school survivors and so many different descendants of boarding school survivors, going back to that, that elder and generational impact. We have descendants 3, 4, even just parents, but 2, 3 generations out that still don't know very much about their culture or their language because it was just not allowed to be taught to them. And this is also something that, I saw personally really affected a lot of how these kids get raised, right? I mean, they get raised and it sometimes parents, they don't know how to deal with this trauma that's happened to them. And so they don't know how to respond to their children either. And maybe they don't, treat them with the most emotionally loving types of, compassionate things. And maybe they weren't raised with that. And so we have to understand the ways that boarding schools and the foster care system has historically impacted the ways that we have treatments within our families. There's an intrapersonal factor involved with all of this trauma that has been perpetuated through time. And so the Road to Healings tour, it was, while heavy and huge that it was with all of these people, local and afar, meeting with Deb Haaland, it was also a very universal experience in terms of just getting together and talking through and figuring out a way to talk around and talk through this trauma. And it's not easy and it's very uncomfortable. And it's very uncomfortable, certainly for journalists who are not Indigenous, who don't understand the histories going into it anyway. And then you also have to factor that you have survivors and participants that are going to be speaking to Deb Haaland in addition to all of this, right? And so it was just a really big moment of understanding that boarding schools have way more far-reaching effects than we even think it does. We understand that it has impacted, the ways that language and stories have been perpetuated down in generations, but we still need to be searching to examine the deeper picture of how it affects families.
One of your first trips for us will be to Washington, D.C. in early November to be in the city as the Supreme Court hears the oral arguments in Brackeen v. Haaland, which, as we've talked about already, could decide the fate one way or the other of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So how are you feeling about this trip upcoming?
Oh, I'm excited to be back in DC. I covered the Hill in college for a semester in the fall. It was great. I'm very comfortable being in DC, and I'm excited to go back to the Supreme Court steps just because I'm really kind of anticipating a big crowd. I'm anticipating a lot of emotion. I'm anticipating a lot of activism. I'm very aware of the historical activism that's been done by our tribes in DC, and I'm carrying all of that ancestral work with me. We're doing this lead up piece about the emotions running high leading up to, I'm very grateful to be there on the anniversary of ICWA. This is a huge moment in DC, but it's a huge moment across Indian country because this is the 44th year of this law protecting Native families and keeping them together. And we are dealing with a Supreme Court challenge where there are 4 children involved and only one of them went back to their Native family. And it's something that is important that the public understands that that's the way it is. We can talk all day long about what we would want and what, the proponents and the opponents of ICWA would say, but it doesn't change what it is and what the arguments are saying now and what the arguments are perceptually doing to impact the lives of these children.
You can follow all of the work that Nancy Marie Spears is going to be doing on this issue and many others at the Imprint, which you can check out at imprintnews.org, or just follow us on our social media channels at the Imprint News. But Nancy Marie Spears, thanks for jumping on the Imprint Weekly Podcast with me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you again for having me. You guys can follow me on Twitter at thisisnancys, or email me at nspears@imprintnews.org.
There you go. One additional note before we take a quick break. As Nancy and I just discussed, the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments in Brackeen v. Haaland on November 9th, which is the day after the 44th anniversary of ICWA and also the day after what is sure to be a very raucous midterm election day. So stay tuned to the Imprint for Nancy's great reporting on the case in these coming weeks and afterwards. I am also going to be dedicating quite a bit of time to ICWA and to the Brackeen case on the podcast for these weeks leading up to the oral argument. So starting next week, we are going to feature a steady slate of guests to discuss some of the key aspects of ICWA, really with the goal of providing listeners with a good understanding of how this law impacts child welfare cases every day right now. I think a lot of the discussion about ICWA tends to revert to the history that led up to it, which is extremely important to recognize and process. But I do think, it's also important to understand, that this is a living law that is having an impact every single day in child welfare courts across the country, particularly in some states. So it's good to have just a good, fundamental understanding of what exactly this law entails. And in the final week of that kind of series, we'll call it Understanding ICWA, we'll connect those major provisions in the law to this Brackeen case, and we'll talk about some of the possible outcomes of Brackeen v. Holland and what could actually happen as a result of the Supreme Court's action there. So stay tuned in the next couple of weeks to the Imprint Weekly podcast for some of those interviews. And when we come back right now, our conversation with Lawanda Ravoira.
This episode is sponsored by iFoster. If you're listening to this podcast, we assume you care deeply about improving the foster care system. Last year, more than 2,400 youth, caregivers, and frontline workers from across the nation took the time to tell iFoster what's needed to improve foster care in this country. Their voices are being heard, and now it's your turn. Please join this year's Voice of the Community survey, available online now at voiceoffostercare.org. That's voiceoffostercare.org.
We are joined today by Lawanda Ravoira, President Emeritus of the Delores, Barr, Weaver Policy Center in Jacksonville, Florida, who is perhaps the most knowledgeable person in the country when it comes to girls and young women in the juvenile justice system. Ravoira's organization recently put out a blueprint for better serving at-risk girls in Florida. So we'll talk about that and her career and more. So Lawanda, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we start every interview the same here, just so the folks get to know you a little bit. You got to give me one of your favorites. You can give me more if you like, but here are the categories: movie, TV show, book, musical group, or sports team. Lawanda, what do you got?
My music would be Cat Stevens.
Cat
I
Stevens,
am
great
a
choice.
great follower of Cat Stevens. My movie that I watch over and over and over is Sound of Music. Love it. And my book, probably that I go back to a lot and reread, is To Kill a Mockingbird. And what was my other one?
Oh, wow.
My sports team.
Are you going for all five? The sports team and TV show are the other two.
Yes. Well, sports team. Now that I moved to Indiana, I'm a big Indiana Colts fan. Used to be a big Jaguar fan, but now Indiana Colts fan.
Oh, wow. Okay. Do you want to go for the full five and tell me a TV show? You're the first guest to ever do all five.
Okay. Let me see my TV show. Well, my TV show has to be Handmaid's Tale. I think it's reflective of what I'm seeing happening. So totally. I am waiting for the next season. I'm that person.
Got you. So, Lawanda, you have done the leadership thing. It kind of occurred to me in juvenile justice at all angles. You ran the PACE Center doing direct service work with girls. You led the National Center for Girls and Young Women, which is kind of a big picture, national level thing, really the first, honestly, national organization to look at that issue. And then to the Delores, Barr, Weaver Center to focus on kind of a statewide plan and really doing things on the state level. But before we get into any of that, I'm just curious, because I don't know, what was your first foray into working with girls in the juvenile justice system? What was your first job in this space?
Well, my first job that was really focused just on girls was at PACE Center for Girls. But prior to that, I had worked at Covenant House in Fort Lauderdale. And at Covenant House, one of the programs that I ran was the Mommy Baby program, where, I started to learn about girls who were runaway and homeless and living on the streets, and many were pregnant and parenting. So I actually did my doctoral dissertation around teen pregnancy and homeless and runaway girls. And then when I met Vicki Burke, who was the founder of PACE Center for Girls, it's when I really started looking into gender and the differences of what was happening, particularly with girls in Florida.
Right. And did you come into that job at the top, or did you work for PACE as a line worker or more directly before you kind of took over?
Well, I had actually transitioned from I left my position at a Covenant House because after I got my doctorate degree, I had this vision that you had to go to Washington, D.C. and do advocacy to really change the world.
Right.
And so I went to Washington, got a great job with the national network, and realized change happens at the local level. It does not happen in Washington. So I was fortunate enough to be under contract to write a book on teen pregnancy and homelessness. And so I went back to Florida after spending a gray winter in Washington and set up a writing studio. And my former supervisor at Covenant House met Vicki and said, "You need to meet Lawanda. She's as crazy about girls' issues as you are." And so Vicki called, and I started as a consultant with PACE. And then Vicki, I made a commitment that I would move to Jacksonville for 1 year and help her, just because the program was very grassroots, to set up policies and processes. And then when I moved, she let me know that she wanted to step down as the state director. And so I moved into the state director position rather quickly. But, at the time, PACE it was 3 small centers serving about 100 girls. And Vicki had secured the funding to open 2 more programs. And so I was helping her to open the Fort Lauderdale and the Miami program, and Pensacola and Tallahassee. But it was still very grassroots and small and local.
But, and I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that just what you described there, the size of PACE, God, I don't even know how many years ago that was, 20 whatever years ago.
Yeah.
That would probably still be one of the biggest organizations dedicated to direct services and just serving girls in the juvenile justice system now. Like, I still think of PACE as the biggest player. I guess I would say them and like the Center for Young Women's Development in San Francisco are the ones that I always think of. But like, am I wrong? I mean, have you seen, a proliferation of dedicated direct service types around the country?
I think that PACE absolutely is, because it's statewide and because it's very focused. I think they have about 21 or 22 programs. When I left, we had grown to 22 programs across the state. And because it's such a statewide presence and dedicated to girls who are at risk or who are in the juvenile justice system, with such a unified strategy in terms of intervention. So I do think it is one of the few in the country. We can look at like Girl Scouts and Girls Inc., who were doing that kind of national work, but really focused on girls in or at risk of the justice system. Certainly PACE was the leader, and I think continues to do just incredible work.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's certainly the biggest game in town that we have in the country. So you didn't get lured back to DC, but you did get lured back into national stuff. I remember interviewing you when you took over the nascent National Center for Girls and Young Women. I think Barry Chrisberg at the time, who was leading NCCD, National Center on Crime and Delinquency, which is now a different name that I'm blanking on. But, I just remember him saying that, we're starting this basically because right now in this country, girls programs in juvenile justice are just boys programs painted pink, which is a classic line. I don't know if he fed him that one. But looking back on that work, because I think you were there for about 5 years, what are you most proud of? What do you feel like you guys moved the ball on, so to speak, with that center?
I did make the transition after I left PACE. And one of the reasons that I left PACE is not because I didn't love the work, but I'd always been involved in research and looking at broader issues that were pushing girls into the system. So I would go into these residential lockup facilities and I'd have my PACE badge on. And invariably, every one I went into, there would be a girl who came up and she would say, "Oh, you're at PACE. I was at PACE Tampa, or I was at PACE Daytona." And it was just heart-wrenching. And I kept thinking, where did we fail? Why is she here? Why is she in this lockup facility? So I wanted to figure out what could we develop to stop that, to where there would not be girls in these razor wire facilities. And so when I transitioned from PACE, Barry Chrisberg had always been a role model and just someone that I looked up to and a teacher. And so I had worked with him and NCCD in doing the Rallying Cry for Change research. That was the impetus for the first blueprint that we did in Florida. So I worked with him about creating the 3rd division of NCCD. And, what I'm really proud of in that work, I think that we brought national attention. We started to raise more awareness on a national level. And then we were awarded the OJJDP funding for the National Girls Institute. And with that, we went around the country to try to really understand what was happening to girls. And we did focus groups with girls all over the country, with staff all over the country, trying to really identify what were the best practices. And so I think raising that kind of awareness, creating the resource of the National Girls Institute brought girls back to a place of priority, because, it always ebbs and flows from the early 90s when we saw this increase in focus on girls and saw the political shifts that happened. And so we brought awareness to that. But what I found in that research, which I did with Vanessa Patino Lydia, was that it didn't matter where we went. I mean, and we literally interviewed girls from Alaska, Oregon, Florida, all over the country. And every community that we went in, they were really struggling with services for their girls and how to intervene with their girls. So I think raising awareness, making girls a priority, and bringing resources was some of our greatest accomplishments.
I kind of agree. Yeah, I definitely remember interviewing you after this, when we'll talk about this next, but your move to Delores Barr Weaver, and you were just kind of bluntly, I very much remember that conversation, because you were like, we're on this listening tour and people are asking, what do you do there? What do you do here?
Right.
What is this thing? And it's like, I don't have an answer because we don't know that. So maybe the easiest way to say the value of doing the exercise of that national center was simply to at least expose and raise up, this is a growing issue and we don't have answers yet.
That's right. And every community that we went in was looking for guidance.
Right.
They were looking for solutions. They were looking for resources, and they just didn't exist. And I think the saddest thing for me during that was recognizing nobody's getting this right. And it's a lot of people trying really hard without the guidance and the framework on what needs to happen. And girls were just being lost.
Would you say that you also felt that way about, your guys' own work at PACE? I mean, I'm kind of hearing that come through. It's like we're fighting the good fight, but you're still lamenting seeing how many young women that you work with end up in the lockups.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think PACE was very successful. And what I finally had to come to terms with as the CEO of PACE is when I was there, PACE was very successful, and it was always designed as a prevention and early intervention program. So girls who were being referred, who had just serious mental health issues, whose needs were just much more complex than PACE as a day treatment program in a school was ever designed to address, we were not being successful with those girls. And they needed a very different kind of much more intensive intervention than we were providing. So sometimes it's just having to recognize, although you want to do everything in one program, there has to be specialized services that are really aligned with the needs of girls. And that was a hard lesson for me because, I have the audacity to think we can do this if we just work harder, if we put in more hours.
Yeah, it's like your career kind of just went on probably by accident, but on a very weirdly rational roller coaster, because you started with the direct stuff, which provides you with the base to at least know what to ask and go looking for with this national job. You find out everybody out here wants answers and doesn't have it. And then comes the Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center, which is the ultimate sort of lab to try and create the right mousetrap, right? So let's start with its origin, though, because I think the managerial class who maybe listen to this podcast every once in a while would love to know how you talked an NFL owner into caring this much about juvenile justice.
Well, first, I have to always acknowledge Delores Barr Weaver and her incredible commitment to women and girls issues. And with NCCD, one of the things that we were doing across the country with the National Girls Center is we were going into communities using our system framework for change to help them to develop strategic plans to address girls. And, one of the things that I would continually be asked is, well, what's happening in Duval County, which is where the center was located.
Right.
And I had to acknowledge that we were kind of the worst of the worst. In fact, Duval County was locking up during that time more girls than any other county in the state of Florida. And in fact, more than Miami, Tampa, and Fort Lauderdale combined.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was just a sobering moment of realizing that with the national work, if we really want to have a model for this country, then let's just start in my own backyard.
Yeah.
Where literally the detention center was painted Pepto-Bismol pink. Literally, the girls' unit was literally
the
painted
fulfilled
pink.
prophecy.
It was literally pink.
Yeah.
So I had partnered with the children's campaign, Roy Miller and the children's campaign.
Yep.
And so we wrote a grant to the Women's Giving Alliance to convene a leadership council to really bring together citizen leaders in Jacksonville and Duval County that had absolutely nothing to do with the juvenile justice system, but they were really strategic thinkers. They were heading, international businesses. And one of those members was Delores Barr, along with 11 members. And so I took the research to this group. And I remember at one point, we were discovering like 850 little elementary school age girls were being suspended. K through 5th grade were being suspended. And so I just kept bringing the research, and Delores sat through these meetings and she listened and she listened. And so it was a series of really educating these leaders about this is happening to an invisible population of girls, and really grounded in the research and coming forth with solutions. And she invited me after one of the meetings to bring her a proposal. And, I was not thinking big enough at the time. I said, well, I had recommendations in the presentation. And she said, I want you to think bigger than that. So, that's a moment in your life that doesn't happen. And so I took 6 weeks and met with confidants, and Roy Miller was certainly one of them, and Linda Alexianic and Julia Taylor, who was also on the Leadership Council, and developed a proposal. And I brought it to her. And I realized after all the work that I had done nationally and at the local level, that we had to bring under one umbrella research, advocacy to change public policy, and programs that would really be innovative, that were grounded in the girls in our community. And then we had to train all of the partners who could make a different decision for girls. And if we could do that under one umbrella in one county, that maybe we could start to set the model for the rest of the country. And on August 13th, 2012, I took her a 5-page proposal. And it was my dream. And she said yes to the proposal.
Wow. Happy 10-year anniversary. That was like 4 days ago. 10 years ago today.
It was like an amazing, and of course I was at NCCD, so I had to unwrap the National Center. Yeah. And so we didn't open until January 2013, but the yes came 10 years ago, and it certainly has had an incredible impact on Duval County, where we went from being the worst to, since our inception, a 74% reduction in girls being incarcerated.
So you feel confident now that you can walk out anywhere in this country and say, this place where I was at is a model for how you can do better by girls?
Absolutely. And we have documented the successes, and it's documented in research and the evaluation of the successes of our public policy advocacy, from changing laws to creating the continuity of care services, where we literally are in schools. The Girl Matters, it's elementary. We are working with stopping suspension of girls in elementary school. We are girls in the middle. We are in middle school, girls in the community, where we're in court. We're with girls on probation and detention. And then we also launched the Open Doors Outreach Network, which is now statewide, serving survivors of sex trafficking, which is a large population of girls who are ending up in the system. But with that, we have the Girl Centered Practice Institute, where we're doing the training law enforcement all the way to prosecutors to direct service providers. And so all of that under one umbrella, we've had incredible success, and it can be done in any community.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
Did you see the press release the Department of, I think it was DOJ or FBI, put out about the recovery of all the underage girls this week?
I did. And there was a significant number of those in Jacksonville. My antenna goes up with those releases they put out, just only because I think you'd read that and think, oh, this is 100 young people that are going back to a home that has been putting flyers up, and it's messy, And I'm always thinking, are these girls getting rescued right into an arrest? It's very well. And not only that, one of the issues that we are working on, we are seeing girls, they are ending up in detention. And so much of it is around crimes associated with their victimization, because the traffickers are smart. They use the girls' cell phones. They use their names on the hotels and all of that. And so they end up with these charges that follow them the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
It's not the fantasy rescue story, I think, that people may create, that they've been rescued. We're not talking about what services, what interventions are available. And my suspicion is very few.
Yeah. So you guys spent the last 10 years trying to build kind of a model for doing this in the country, but also, I guess more locally to the rest of the state of Florida. And I would imagine that like I said, you're probably not going anywhere, but you're quasi-retiring, and on the way out, you guys have produced this blueprint for Florida called See the Girl, which honestly, reading it kind of easily could just be a proxy for a national blueprint to some extent. I would imagine that this is a document that expresses the lessons learned from those 10 years. So do you want to hit the highlights for people, like what the core things Florida need to do to sort of look more like Duval in other places?
Sure, absolutely. And we really, there's so many things that are broken. So we were very thoughtful in terms of integrating the research. We had completed a major 3-part series of the status of girls in Florida. And we looked at, although much success has been garnered in terms of passing our safe harbor laws, of expungement of juvenile records and banning child marriage, different things like that. Over the last 5 years, we've still seen 40,000 girls arrested and 12,000 in detention, and 1,400 in lockup and 250 placed in the adult system. And we know that the most at risk are Black girls, where they make up 21% of the population, but 45% arrest and 47% incarcerated. So we wanted to come forth with very bold reforms. And we started with increasing the age of arrest, because we know in Florida, up until last year, there wasn't really a limit. And so little girls as young as 6 years old were being handcuffed, fingerprinted, and arrested and taken to detention. And Kaya Roll was one of the little girls. She was 6 that got arrested in Orlando that made national headlines. And so we passed a law that the current law is now you can't arrest a child under the age of 7. But interestingly, Kaya is 8. So the law in her name wouldn't even protect her. And this was a child who was having a temper tantrum in school. And so increasing the age of arrest, at least to age 12, even though, the UN calls for age 14, is one area, because it's not just an isolated incident. We've had over 500 girls under the age of 12 arrested in Florida. And
say that again, how many?
500. 500 little girls under the age of 12 were arrested in 2020.
Just in 2020.
Wow. Is that not sobering?
And it's funny. I was talking to Ricky Watson, who used to run the National Juvenile Justice Network, about the raising the floor concept. And it's almost like the states that have the kind of crazy low age get all the attention, but that belies the fact that like half the states, theoretically, it could be a baby. You arrest a baby, they get off by just not even having the things of Florida. It's so weird. Like Florida went from none to like just a law that would almost make it seem more ridiculous to other people. So
I'm like, okay, we can still arrest an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
An 8-year-old. It's a child who is just screaming. It's a siren for help. And so the response is arrest. So that's one of the priorities. The other issue that you've heard me talk about this, John, I think since you've known me, is the really misuse of the domestic violence laws. We know that there's just family disturbances, there's fractured homes. And in Duval County, we saw that 41% of the girls who were in lockup were there for domestic violence charges. And this is just a family in crisis. And this should be addressed in the child protection system, not the juvenile justice system. So we're really advocating for amending those statutes to take away the arrests for family disturbances. We do not want to weaken the domestic violence laws and the intent for adult abuse that was happening. So that's a major part of our focus.
Yeah.
And we also just had a change in Florida last year to the detention criteria that authorizes the courts to extend the stay in detention, which is a dangerous direction for the state because we are especially concerned about the impact that that's going to have on trafficking survivors. Just as we were talking about before, keeping them in detention for their own protection, girls who run away, keeping them there for their own protection, and for girls who are charged with domestic violence, when families aren't ready to allow their daughters to come home, they get this extended stay in detention, which just derails their future even more.
So would you say, I remember talking to you about this like more than a decade ago, but would you say that we have in any way moved the needle on what I would think is the core differentiation, at least in the deep end of the system, between how boys and girls are treated, which is that judges have largely backed off using detention for status offenders when they're boys and not for girls. Is that still the case now?
I think that we've moved the needle a tiny bit, but girls are still arrested. They're placed in detention for far less serious offenses than boys.
Yeah.
So that attitude, that paternalistic attitude of needing to protect girls just continues to push her into the system quicker. And we see her punished much more harshly for less serious offenses. And the technical violations of probation, we see girls push back into the system at a much higher rate for technical violations of probation than we do for boys. So that just continues.
I don't even know what it would be, but have you guys messed around with anything in Duval or come up with a good answer to the judge who's coming at it from the perspective of, I don't want to detain this girl, but I'm not comfortable somewhat paternalistically sending her back to the situation that she came in, whether that's home or something. I mean, is there a middle ground that we've experimented with there or what?
There is. And in fact, our continuity of care program, we actually now are able to take to judges a care management plan that's an alternative to incarceration that addresses those very concerns that the judges have. And I will say we've had tremendous success. We've seen young women who were facing 30 years in prison not go to prison because of courageous judges who saw that when the policy center stepped up and said, we will provide her with this level of intensive interventions and whatever reporting you want us to do, we will report to you to address what's the need that's driving the behavior. So much of that is around the education and the training piece of helping our judges to understand it is the trauma that's driving behavior, and trying to control behavior isn't going to change anything, but addressing the need. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as providers to provide a comprehensive care management strategy that addresses all of those concerns that judges have when the girls come up before them in court, whether it's how she's going to go to school, where she's going to live, where she's going to work, where is she going to get counseling, how is she going to get back and forth to court. I mean, we do that kind of comprehensive plan.
If somebody from, a random county saw you speak and called you up and said, Lawanda, we really want to get started on doing better by the girls in our system, where would you start? What is the first program we need to put in place or concept we need to write into our policy? Like, what is that answer? What is the first step? Because I think right? Would you agree? Like a lot of the country is still on step one.
I would say the first step is you have to know who your girls are. You have to sit with your girls, have focus groups with your girls, focus groups with your family to really understand what are the needs of the girls in your community. Then you develop your programs and services and your strategic plan that's really grounded in the lived experiences and the expertise of the very people who are most impacted by the system. So we start by listening. We have a community system framework that we used, and we've used it in communities across the country to say, start by listening. Who are your girls? Because I think one of the things that happens is we try to say, well, let's take this program from Jacksonville and put it in this city in New York. But your girls, although they may have similar experiences, the programs need to be designed based on their needs. So listening to girls and truly, John, seeing girls as the experts of their lives and as your equal partners in creating the solutions.
Yeah. I think that's the right answer. I'm going to push again, though, because I think people would get a kick out of hearing it. Give me your favorite direct service program you've worked to develop, either at PACE or Delores Barr, or both. Bring one to life for listeners. This program works with girls in this way, and here's what we've found. The impact is.
Yeah, so I'd have to say the Girl Matters in the Community program, which the staff are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it is real-time services when the girls need them. And so it is sitting with the girl, doing her assessment, listening to her vision for her life, and then wrapping the services around her. Services that are available real-time, taking them to her community, not sitting in our office waiting for girls to come to us. And so the services are going to include care management. It includes counseling. It includes home visits. It includes when she's in court, we're in court with her. When she's in detention, wherever she is at in the system, because these girls move from court to detention to residential to reentry. It doesn't matter where she's at in the system. She has the same staff that is working with her, and she has a number that she knows that staff is available 24/7, because we know when families get in crisis and when girls get in crisis, it's never 9 to 5. It's Saturday night at midnight. And so having that kind of real-time, comprehensive services available is the core of the Girl Matters in the Community program.
Right. I want to ask you for the Florida perspective, or maybe even just a more local one, on something that every once in a while pops up as an issue nationally, but I feel like nobody does anything really to move it forward. And that is kind of this dual system crossover youth concept, the number of young people who experience both foster care or at least child welfare along with juvenile justice. So what do you see on the local level in terms of how those systems connect, and how much does it contribute, in your opinion, to, over involvement of girls in the juvenile justice side?
What we see in Florida is about 1 out of 3 girls in the juvenile justice system is a crossover girl. So they've had experience in the foster care system.
So they may not be in it currently, but they have had contact with it.
Right. They definitely had contact. So there's definitely that crossover. They've been in both of those systems. And I want to first preface this by saying, I think there's really good people working in both the juvenile justice and the child protection system. They are just so underfunded and undersupported, and the complexity of the needs of the kids it's like the juvenile justice system becomes the graduation when we fail in the foster care system. And it's extremely frustrating. But I think what's lacking is the investment in the family and in the community where the girls are living to keep them out of the foster care system. I had an experience once, John. I was in court and there was a family whose daughter was being taken from them. And actually, it was already up to where she was going to be adopted by another family. And so I saw this mother and daughter by themselves. I was in court with another girl waiting for us, but and the mother and daughter were standing up before the judge all by themselves. And the family that was going to adopt
like
was
lawyers
just surrounded. They were just surrounded by all these people. And it was this sobering moment of, what if we had all those people around this mother? And I feel like that's our failure. We fail to really invest in a family in crisis until after the fact, until there's so much fracture and so much loss, and we just abandon them. And I feel like that's where we can shift and do something different.
For sure. I want to ask you, as maybe kind of like the middle thread between juvenile justice and child welfare in Florida that I have talked to some child welfare experts in Florida about before, and that is the Baker Act. Tell people what it is and kind of how it plays into your guys' work.
Certainly, the Baker Act is the involuntary commitment of a young person or anyone for mental health. And although we didn't talk about this in our blueprint, this most current blueprint, we have done the research locally and looking at the increased use of Baker Acts, and particularly Baker Acts. We were trying to figure out, where are they happening? Are they happening in school? Because we were seeing an increase as well. And we looked at the percentage that were happening in school, the percentage that were happening at home. And what was surprising to us is that the significant number of Baker Acts that were actually happening in the community and at home, as well as in school. And so that was actually an issue that we had a great deal of strategic meetings about with partners in our community. And we were particularly concerned because we were seeing Baker acted from school and their parents weren't even being notified. So, I mean, it's
That's
frightening
crazy.
when you think about these decisions that are being made. And I think where we landed, it is a reflection of the lack of mental health services. And so we resort to Baker Act when we don't know what else to do. It becomes this reaction of getting services. So these kids are ending up in these Baker Act facilities as opposed to, because we lack services in the community, we're putting them in these crisis centers.
That's why I wanted to ask you about it, because it kind of occurred to me that this is kind of like an interesting wrinkle in the continuum for you guys. Because on the one hand, I mean, anything that's overused to the extent it seems the Baker Act is problematic. I mean, if you just look at the chart of how often it's used, it's kind of crazy how much it's gone. And on the other hand, I guess you could say, right, that using it in some cases may prevent juvenile justice involvement for a girl that in another place may have been dealt with by getting arrested. Is that true, or am I way off there? Like,
if I think about sort of the choice of arrest or Baker Act, I think both of those, there may be times when a young person absolutely needs to be Baker Acted when there is a real crisis happening. But my fear, and I think what we've seen, is the Baker Act gets used as a fallback. And it's just an inappropriate intervention that further traumatizes, further victimizes, because we have not invested in having services available to address the trauma and the mental health needs of children. It's like almost a false choice. Baker Act or arrest. Well, no.
I hear you. I
the intervention needs to be the right services.
Yeah. But I think that situation seems like it would be created by the very concept of it being overused. Like, in a world where there were more community-based mental health options for kids that only needed that, let's say there was, in that hypothetical world, you've got some girl that shows up to school and she's having a real serious mental health episode, pulls a knife on somebody or something really dangerous. And that girl ends up Baker acted and put somewhere temporarily. In that world, I would think that's better than having her get arrested, having her in a detention center where,
Oh, absolutely. And so when the Baker Act is really used properly with the intent of she's a risk to herself or she's a risk to others, that's the absolute best solution. But we have to make sure that the Baker Act receiving facilities are actually quality services. That's a whole other level, because once they get into these facilities, is the girl-centered, and particularly for girls, are there girl-centered treatment options available that's really addressing her needs versus a holding place where we're using medication, we're not really doing the appropriate assessments and diagnosis and interventions that's needed. It becomes a holding place, and then she's released. And it's that cycle, it's that constant revolving door, whether it's in these Baker Act facilities or in the juvenile justice system. And so I guess that's my frustration for decades of doing this work, because that's what I continually see.
Yeah, and I think just to put an end point on this, I think I can totally see why. I can't even imagine actually how frustrating it would be to have something that theoretically could help be then turned into something you have to somewhat oppose the practice of,
Right. And again, I don't oppose Baker acting when used properly. And then when the services that follow that are really designed to meet need, but
no, I get
using it sometimes just to remove the kids, that becomes just another traumatizing failure of our system's interventions.
Yeah. So the federal government has probably a little bit in credit to you guys at the National Center work, right? For a while now, it's had this $2 million write-in for, within the juvenile justice budget, specifically for girls. I saw that last year that went up. It's still pretty small, but it's twice as big. It's like 4.5 million. So there's more resources going to this issue. I'm curious what you think the federal government is doing well when it comes to girls in juvenile justice, and what you think you would like to see them do more.
Well, we're excited that there's at least some acknowledgement and increase in funding. And in fact, the Policy Center, in partnership with Georgetown University, received one of the OJJDP grants to launch the Girl-Centered Practice Institute. It's a partnership that we're doing with Georgetown through the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. And so we have a Girl-Centered Practice certificate program. It's a national training program. We're excited. We're actually next week, we're doing the training in Florida where people will earn their certificate in girl-centered practice. So I'm excited that there's an increase. There certainly needs to be much more of an increase in funding. What I would like to see happen, I'm sure that you remember in the 90s, with the reauthorization of the OJJDP Act, when that reauthorization mandated for the first time that states have a plan in place on how they were going to address gender-specific services for girls. And that plan was then tied to funding that came to the states. And during that time, we just saw this blossoming of local and state task force across the country that was really focused on girls, and the local communities were coming forth and providing solutions. And the federal government was issuing guidelines on what services should look like, what best practices were. They were investing in the training. And I would really hope to see the federal government really taking the lead and making girls a national priority again, because that's gotten lost.
So as we said at the top here, you are president emeritus now, kind of headed into quasi-retirement. Vicki Bosra has succeeded you as president and CEO of Delores Barr Weaver. What do you think is on the horizon for the center? What do you expect to see out of them as you kind of exit stage right in the next 5 years?
I'm excited with Vicki's leadership, and the Policy Center will be a much broader and louder and bolder voice in policy reforms. That's a major focus with the release of the blueprint, and also really elevating the research and public awareness about what's happening with girls. And I see also the expansion of the programming. And initially, the Policy Center was designed to be a really incubator to develop these innovative programs, to then develop the replication models so that other communities could replicate the programs. And I see that happening. Vicki's already expanded outside of the 5-county area, and I see a much bolder national voice of really raising the issues and sharing the successes of the Policy Center on a national level. And that's especially happening now with the partnership with Georgetown and the National Training Center that is being launched as part of this work.
Lawanda Ravoira, President Emeritus of the Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for always lifting up the stories of girls, John. I appreciate you.
Thanks to Lawanda Ravoira for joining us today, and thanks to Accenture and iFoster for sponsoring this episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voice program. This podcast episode was produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with help from Sarah Kim, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd greatly appreciate it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would really appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.